Hello and welcome to the Indie Boys Development Podcast, a game development log of an indie game development project. I'm Casey.
And I'm Amanda.
And that's it for today.
And that's it.
Yep, there is no Alex. The mediating force is gone. Chaos reigns.
This is a two-person podcast.
Yeah. Chaos reigns, and Chaos is going to talk about telling stories today.
Yeah, for ideally less than an hour for you listener, but possibly
for
a
us,
lot
potentially
longer
a lot longer than an hour.
And we're going to make Alex sit through all of it.
Yes, every minute of it. That's what he gets for not being here.
So we've got a narrative game in some sense, and from the beginning we knew it was going to be a narrative game. Like, if you remember, Casey, like way back when we were making our Block 2 prototype, the prototype didn't have any narrative, but there was narrative ideas.
It had a slide at the beginning that set up who you were.
Oh, you're right.
But
no, I totally forgot. We should have pulled up those slides and read them on this podcast.
I don't know where they are.
I know where they are. I have them. If you want to wait and we want to edit out the silence, I can go find them. Right? Oh, here's our slide deck from the pitch. This might have something. Yeah, okay. So, from our slide deck of the pitch, two friends arrive at a hotel in Prague. Both wait in the lobby but cannot find each other, having been drawn into a loop that degenerates the deeper they go. They work together to uncover the mysteries of their surroundings and face the vastness of the unknown. Together, but alone.
Okay. Some things...
Fall 2019. November 19th, 2019.
Fall 2019. Almost.
We were ahead of the curve.
We were together but alone before it was cool.
Ooh, yeah.
We were quarantine hipsters. No. Yeah, some stuff made it. Together but alone made it into the game trailer all the way. And then the element of a deteriorating loop made it. But again, a lot of like the contextual information. I'm going to say this now. There's going to be spoilers for the game in this.
Yes, we got to preface this. If you are listening to this podcast, but you don't want to be spoiled for the end of the game, beware.
Yeah, that's your.
You will be spoiled for the end of the game.
If you're one of the listeners who found the podcast before the game and have yet to play it, spoilers. Spoilers ahead.
Pause. Yeah, pause right now.
Pause right now. Go play the game.
Go grab a friend.
Takes 40 minutes at the most. And here there.
Draw your own conclusions and theories,
and then we'll confirm
and then come
them all
resume.
for you. All right.
Exactly.
Okay. So yeah, some stuff did maintain. The degenerating loop maintained. The two existing people maintain, and then, but a lot of it very quickly. I wouldn't even say very quickly went to the wayside, but narrative was not the priority for the first 6 weeks after we got going. Like, there were meetings and they were very loosely shaping it out, but arguably those narrative meetings were more like game structure design meetings than they were what story do we want to tell and how do we want to tell it. Arguably they didn't really get close to that until I think I would say the spring quarter. So when I have a different perspective that I can
well, because it was get into.
When the previous narrative director in the winter ran it, it was structure, and it was just starting to get into assets and framework when I took over. Because they didn't want to do it anymore, not because it was a hostile takeover. But so it shifted around there and became, that's where we started working on assets. But that was a few weeks after the Galaxy Brain moment that kind of solidified the broad strokes of the narrative, which is kind of what the early meetings did, is they went, they never got into fiddly detail. They were doing broad strokes of who are you, what's the deal, what's going on, how is it going on, but it hadn't gotten into the detail yet.
Yeah. What I wanted to talk about was those early, post-pitch meetings. The big narrative change was location, which we've talked about on this podcast before. We went from a hotel in Prague to and vaguely American
Yeah.
science and education
Yeah.
museum. And
The
that
Bay
big
Area-ish
change,
located
yeah, Bay Area
Bay Area
inspired.
vibe.
Um, hmm Big inspirations from the Exploratorium, for one, in San Francisco. Um, but yeah, so that was a big narrative change. We kept the fact that the players were friends, and were trying to find each other, that they had arrived at this place, but had arrived like in disparate time loops. Um, and so, like, we retained a lot of that stuff for a little while. It was midwinter. I remember very specifically, we had two members of the team, like, had come up with this sort of narrative overhaul, and pitched it to me and to the narrative lead at the time. And it was like, they are the scientist. Both players are the scientist. They're in these separate overlapping fragments of reality. And, you know, they created the device that broke and trapped them here. And I really think that was the moment. That's the Galaxy Brain moment. That's when we knew what our like story was.
Yeah.
It was, you know, the same person embodied by the two different players. And a lot of
Yeah,
details came
sorry.
later.
Which is something kind of fundamentally different than other games of the genre,
Hmm.
where the two players were distinct entities and the environment
Hmm.
made a semblance of sense. But
What I loved about it, just sorry before you keep
no, it's
going,
alright.
is that our sort of game point of reference, TikTok Tale for Two, also has a really great sort of twist ending. Which, if you've played it, you'll know it was about like time being stolen from the players.
Spoilers.
So I loved having, yeah, spoilers. I'm sorry,
Spoiler warning for
but
any game we talk about, because we're going to talk about
this is
storytelling.
just,
So if we bring up a
yeah, this is
game
not
or
a
a TV
spoiler
show,
free
we're going to
zone.
spoil it.
Yeah. But it's so impactful to have a twist like that, like at the end, that you can theorize throughout the experience and go sort of like bam at the end. Um, okay, I'm sorry. That was my aside. What were you saying?
A lot of the kind of problems that I noticed with the narrative when I was still kind of an observer was that we were trying to reconcile elements of our original pitch narrative that no longer worked in
Hmm.
the new setting, or that really had never made sense from the get-go, like the how you ended up in these weird split loops and the reasons for it. And then once we'd settled on the how, which was that the statue would break, the trigger for the statue breaking never made sense until
Yeah, in our early iteration, we had the idea that the two friends have gone into the museum and they break the statue by accident, and now the whole game's goal is we have to fix it because we broke it,
yeah.
um,
and that
or something like
and
that.
that the scientist as a character I think existed at that point, but it was to find
Hmm.
out who they were, period. And the environmental storytelling of the game was to just explain who they were, which
Hmm.
is interesting, but the payoff is missing.
Yeah, it didn't have like strong ties to what was actually
Yeah.
happening in the game. It was like, oh, okay, this explains why time has gone weird, why we're trapped, who created this area. But it had no impact. That was the thing. It had no impact on the play experience. It was like, that's fun flavor text.
Yeah, it was
Thank
all
you.
flavor text. And I think a big change,
Yeah.
that Galaxy Brain moment took it from flavor text that exists in the
Hmm.
world, where even then we weren't really focusing on narrative, it wasn't a strong suit of the game, to once that had happened and our payoff existed and the reasons everything was happening locked in, we were like, okay, now we know the story we want to tell.
Hmm.
How do we best tell it in a game? And
Hmm.
in a puzzle game where obviously they're with the player communication, we can't do voice acting because that would talk over the players. We can't do like long breadths of text where one person is reading it and that all breaks down
Hmm.
just because one person will
Yeah,
get
this is
bored, or it
no
won't.
open world.
Yeah, or
Yeah,
it
this is
won't
no like
it won't flow because you could be one kind of player playing with someone else. One of you really likes optional narrative and one of you doesn't.
mhm.
So it kind of then became, how do we reconcile all that? Which is why a lot of our longer narrative assets are were written with the same design philosophy as our puzzles, which was to make it ping pong back and forth between the players. And
Yeah, so like the puzzles, the narrative can't be understood by one player alone. You have to be working together to read the pieces of narrative for the most part and like puzzle out together what's happening and like who the scientist is.
yeah, that was one
Um,
of my favorite kind
yeah.
of core changes that we did to the narrative was
hmm
that in a game centered around puzzles, the narrative was not straightforward. Because a lot of puzzle games will just do
hmm
like a straightforward narrative that's just to justify the existence of all the puzzles. But it's more interesting to say, okay, the game is a series of puzzles. Why not have the overarching narrative that ties together that series of puzzles also be something that you have to puzzle with
hmm
and figure out, and not necessarily just have it told to you right away as you progress forward.
Yeah, I remember testing in winter when we still had a splash screen contextualizing like our opening cutscene. I think that we kept getting comments on it, like, is this sticking around? Because it really felt like you were being spoon-fed in a game that was about being proactive.
Yeah.
And so having the narrative be a puzzle itself is just so thematically like, mwah, like chef's kiss,
Yes.
It's like
Exactly.
it all ties together. It makes me so happy. It's like you're embodying what the game wants you to experience. You're embodying it as well in your narrative
Yeah.
delivery, which I just love. I love
Yeah.
that.
And that gets into also the other big thing is, and this is a problem that I tend to see overall with
hmm
games in general as a medium for storytelling, is that when you're writing a movie or a short story or a novel or a comic or like any other form of storytelling media, you as the author have full control over the order in which the reader experiences the events of your narrative. In a
hmm
game, unless you very heavily limit the player's forward momentum to hit those beats in a row, which works depending on the kind of game you're doing, then you don't have control over, especially in an environmental storytelling game like ours, where you're not being guided through the world like to experience a narrative. It is, we have no control over what. Okay, that's wrong. We have a loose control
hmm
over what order you experience things in. Like we
We
have,
have the progression of the levels
yeah,
to some extent.
but within those levels, we have no control over the order in which you receive a piece of the narrative. That is entirely
hmm
up to the player. So it becomes then to, how do you write a piece of narrative that succinctly exists on its own, fits into a broader narrative, and isn't frustratingly confusing if you've
hmm
say maybe missed a contextualizing piece elsewhere in the game space.
Yeah, like everything needs to simultaneously stand alone and work in context, which is a challenge that I think a lot of games face, especially if they're an open world game. And that's why I think a lot of open world games that I've seen, narrative takes either more of a backseat or it takes a sort of overlay quality. The other day, Casey, we were talking about games that have narrative in like audio format. You can listen to, say, you pick up a tape and you listen to a piece of narrative while you continue forward. I think that's pretty common in games. Like the one that I was specifically referencing was, oh, well, the title is long, and I'm going to need to open my Steam library again. Um, Dr. Langeskov the Tiger and the Terribly Cursed Emerald, A Whirlwind Heast. You pick up pieces of audio log, in that game. You listen to them while you're continuing your forward momentum and exploration that is free range to you as a character. That's by the same people, I believe, as the Stanley Parable, and their narrative takes a similar like narrator quality that doesn't hinder your freedom of movement, your exploration, your activity as a
Yeah.
player.
And a more AAA example of that would be all of the Batman
Mhm.
Arkham games have the
Oh
the
yeah.
audio logs, and
hmm
I think BioShock has them too. A lot of
Yeah, that
a
makes
lot
sense.
of environmental storytelling games that are heavy on exploration lean on that. Like you'll enter an area and an intercom will play, or just something that that can happen without interrupting gameplay.
I affectionately feel like narrative game is an oxymoron.
Yes.
Like, I feel like story is sort of antithetical to what a game is and how interactive a game is. That said, I love narrative games.
Yes, no, they're fantastic.
So,
I mean, we can get into the ludology narratology debate today if we want the podcast to have an extra hour where we establish what those two words mean and then what games balance them well. But I don't know if I necessarily want to go all the way down that rabbit hole yet. So
probably we shouldn't. Yeah. We should have a spin-off podcast.
No, loosely what I will say on that front, as in, to quickly explain it, narratology is the study of narrative, ludology is the study of gameplay. And the argument is that games cannot, if games focus on storytelling, their gameplay has to suffer, or if games focus on gameplay, their story has to suffer. And I think that's true if you go wholly one side or the other, but I think the more interesting design challenge when it comes to that debate is how do you strike a balance between gameplay and narrative, which is a lot more difficult than doing one or the other. And then, which I think we've done a relatively good job of that in terms of, like, all the narrative is presented to you in the same way that gameplay is, wherein you find it and you are then presented with it and then you have to do something with it. So it's not, there's no jarring break in gameplay when you find an item like that.
Yeah.
Like,
we also, at the beginning, were incorporating puzzle hints into the narrative. Which, correct me if I'm wrong, I think fell away because we didn't have enough puzzles that worked with that.
That fell to the wayside because we fell away from the puzzle design that included finding required hints throughout the world. And it fell instead to, there are still written assets in the world that explain solutions to puzzles, but they are not related to the narrative in the same way that the core narrative pieces are. They mention characters presented in the narrative, but they don't help forward the narrative. They're constituent events. They're not, I've forgotten the other word.
Separate? Like, they're not contiguous, they're separate?
They're not required for the entire, they add flavor, but they don't progress the through line of the narrative.
What I think you're saying is there are pieces of writing in the world that reference the narrative without expecting that you have a deep understanding of the narrative yet. And those can help you with the puzzles. For example, the prism puzzle has little plaques on it that help you understand how that puzzle works if you didn't or cannot figure it out through clicking around, if the rules are not vague. If the rules are too vague, that plaque not only explains the mechanics in a little bit of like a hand-holdy way, but it also references the narrative. And if you are following the narrative, you say, oh, I understand the light is important to the scientist's experiment because light is and I'm not remembering what that is exactly, but
the gameplay versus story debate, it's we have a mix of assets in the game that are, some are narrative first and some are gameplay first. So some are some are in the world and exist to be read to aid your gameplay, and some exist in the world to be read to aid your understanding of the overall narrative. And I think the mix of those things is, I think, a strength of the way we tell our story. But I think I want to get into now a little bit more in depth on fully on environmental storytelling and world building before we dive like kind of separate from the game and really talk about writing method.
Yeah, sounds like a good idea.
And I think the start with that is that when you're creating an environmental storytelling game, having written narrative is completely useless if the environment that you place that written narrative in doesn't help expand the things that you find. So if the world doesn't feel lived in, or like that it has experiences. If the world, for lack of a better term, doesn't feel built yet, then you can put any old newspaper clipping that explains a thing in it, and it
Yeah.
doesn't feel right yet.
Hmm.
And I think a strength of that is going kind of, as we shifted direction in our narrative, we maintain that direction in the way that the world looks and the world looked as we go. So
Hmm.
when we shifted away from like you being guests in the museum, the interactables in certain places could change. The brand new puzzle at the beginning of the game with wires could not have existed in the previous version because it.
Yeah, for context, we're adding a tutorial that is a really short wire puzzle, and the implication is you, as the scientist, are booting up your machine. Um, both of you,
Yeah,
both players. Um, yeah, and that wouldn't be possible without the narrative change and without integrating art direction and
yeah.
narrative
I think
together.
because there are games that do that less, wherein the world doesn't feel as like it could exist as much as like where the written narrative is strong but the world is weak. And
Hmm.
a, a strong world can help give a bye to a weak narrative, but a strong narrative cannot help a weak world is what I would think. If you don't,
Hmm.
it's like building a house before you've built the foundation. If you don't have the foundation of a strong world, your narrative will fall flat because it doesn't.
Hmm.
Such an important thing in the way that stories are told is that they exist in a world that makes sense, or that the justifications you provide for as to why it doesn't make sense hold up to some kind of scrutiny.
I think a key aspect here is that games are about immersion. It's like stepping into that magic circle. And if your immersion is not complete, then you can tell the player anything and it's going to be like, whatever,
Yeah, I'm not gonna
you
listen to
know?
you.
Yeah, exactly. So I think one thing that we really did, I feel like a concrete decision that we made that helped tie our world and our narrative together is when we decided that the deterioration of the world was going to start from the very first level. Like the only place you weren't going to see cracks in the environment was going to be in that intro cutscene, and in this case now the tutorial. But it really begins the game with, instead of getting notes that are like, things are broken and things aren't working and the world is weird and the world is broken, now you actually see it too.
You see it
Um,
the very first thing, and then the notes. You go, oh, why is that the case? And then the notes slowly start to justify it and build on that,
mhm,
instead of the other way around, where the world was weaker when we didn't have the cracks, but the notes were saying it, and it would happen later,
mhm,
which was a kind of a cool foreshadowing element, but it didn't nearly work as well as when the foundation of the world presented that, and you could observe it and see it, and then it was
mhm.
justified by written text in the narrative.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think too, the other through line is that we, by removing the friends element and pushing everything to be centered around the scientist, you could wholly experience the mental state of the scientist through the notes and through the newspaper clippings and the other elements of the narrative that you find throughout the world. And then kind of, because you want to know more and more who this character is that's writing these notes that you're finding, you could pretty quickly tie in that the notes are from the scientist that's being mentioned in these articles, but the through line that you are them isn't established until the end, when it becomes a little bit more
Mhm,
obvious. And I think that kind of goes back to our, you can't control the order in which the player experiences the events of your narrative in a game, to the extent that you can control it in a story, because obviously we have controlled it a little bit. We've set the notes that are
mhm,
attainable at a certain time to progress as we go. So there's.
And when you enter a new level, if you didn't find a certain note, it will automatically get put in your journal, so that you can potentially find it in your journal,
Yeah,
even though you've missed the opportunity to
yeah.
pick it up in the environment.
which
So there's a little bit
is
of
technically
that.
because of a technical limitation, but
Shh.
I think it does work to help fill in those slots if you don't find it. But
Mm-hmm.
I think when talking about the order is that we basically have three timelines in the game. We have the timeline that the player is currently experiencing from point to point while they play, the timeline that is presented to the character that goes back in time through the newspaper articles and the research paper, and the note scraps that that the scientist has written that you find that progress forward and then meet at a point where where that first newspaper article was written. So it's an interesting kind of like delivery of the narrative where the third person narrative steps backwards. The first person has a logical progression of the scientist's state of mind forward, and then that's all kind of carried through you uncovering it bit by bit, and both of the timelines that you uncover slowly converge on each other to the point where they're from around the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And then at that point it kind of is that eureka moment where you find out, hey, I the player am the scientist who's written these things. I've gone through this particular loop god knows how many times. Everything's kind of clicked now. I know what's going on. I've figured it out. Nailed it. And I think that payoff is what our original narrative that had we fleshed it out probably would have had, but I don't think it would have been as strong as the payoff that we have right now.
Mm-hmm. I think one aspect of this story structure that is working for our game, that I think would not work in another medium, and that our game would not work without, if that makes sense, is the aspect of discussion. There are a lot of unanswered questions throughout, and we want to encourage discussion between the players in the puzzles, in the entire format of the game. So to do that with the narrative, like, you get these pieces of information that aren't quite connected. They're a little bit backwards chronological. You have the hint at the beginning that you were the one plugging in the statue. And so until later you realize through notes, narrative, and sort of the end cutscene that you yourself are the scientist, it's like that can all be furthered through discussion between the two players. And I think that's really working to our interactive medium really well. And I think it would be harder to do in a medium that wasn't interactable.
Yeah. I think we want to move forward in talking a little bit about method, because that's something that's a little bit more unique than like the development of the narrative and kind of what makes it unique. But the thing that I really wanted to dig into today was specifically the method in which we created the assets, the kind of the editing techniques, the thought about how much information to provide, how clear should they be. And I think probably the best example of this would be, well, actually, I think our full notes document does a really good job of this, and then both of the newspaper articles do a really good job of this, because it's the newspaper articles, at least kind of the method there is they obviously have to read like a newspaper article, but because they're a narrative point in a game where you don't want people to be reading too much, you don't want to provide fluff information that makes it more akin to a newspaper than would be reasonable for to be reasonable to expect a player to read.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a lot of thinking about what information is extraneous, what even words are extraneous. How do we get this information, this newspaper article? There's one in loop 1, one in loop 2, and in loop 3, we actually have a different document that the players find, which is a research document from the scientist. We want to be able to deliver the important information, give a sense of the world, and not let the players get bored. We don't want it to drag on too long, even though we've got this ping pong action of both players need to be reading together to help prevent boredom with reading the narrative. through doing all that, we still have to preserve, it has to feel like a newspaper. Otherwise, it's going to be this prose that's out of context, which would pull the players
Yeah,
out of the world.
it would. If it doesn't, because if it looked like and didn't read like a newspaper, that would break immersion more than if it looks
Mm-hmm.
like and reads like a newspaper but doesn't quite read like a newspaper. You're more willing to forgive that for the sake of
Mm-hmm.
um, succinctness than you would for like if the two mediums were incongruent. And I think the big thing too came from uh, I, as the one who wrote both of the newspaper articles, they were initially written as like a stream of consciousness. Names were improvised on the fly and kind of dropped in just to make the world feel a little more real, so that it weren't just unnamed, untitled figures that moved the narrative forward. And then that kind of leaned into method. Of a big issue in method with the first two newspaper articles was that because of our timeline, we players were not going to experience the third loop of the game, and we hadn't really fleshed out the narrative of the third loop of the game yet. So we didn't know the ending and couldn't very accurately. I don't think we do we do a bunch of heavy foreshadowing, but we do mention of names that recur or subjects that are clarified at the end were absent from early drafts of the newspaper because they didn't exist yet,
Mm-hmm.
and they came back in later versions that like was like, oh, now that I've written this research paper, and now that we've established these kind of core scientific tenets that are the basis of the scientist's work, let's tie them back into these other things, go back to them. And I think that's from that, I think it leads into the first method thing that I want to talk about, which is the order in which to develop your narrative. Because I feel like had we developed that ending initially and then gone to write back the other ones, we'd done that write your first chapter last tip that shows up on a lot of like, here's how to write
Mm-hmm.
your first novel blog posts.
Yeah.
That would have helped us a little bit, but
Mm-hmm.
also it was easy to redraft things with new information, which is
Yeah, my favorite take on that write the first chapter last advice is not necessarily write the first chapter last, but write your first chapter as a placeholder chapter
for your
and
real
edit
first
it
chapter. Yeah,
immediately. Yeah, and then like rewrite or edit it immediately
yeah.
once you have written your
I like
last
that as well
chapter,
because
which
I
is, I
feel
think,
like
the approach that we took with the game. Like, we revised everything once we had figured out that ending in order to tie everything together really nicely.
yeah, and I think the same thing even on smaller scales with every individual asset we talked about. We talked about this during a
Mm-hmm.
meeting before. We can talk about it again now about kind of editing philosophy of going,
Mm-hmm.
do you edit like sentence by sentence, make sure everything's clear, or do you just kind of stream of consciousness, get your clear points out onto the page, format them loosely, and then go back and edit them, cut out extraneous words, remove your run-ons, make sure that things are clear, names are consistent, that maybe this name here needs to be somewhere else to have a reason to exist. Because in early drafts of one of the newspaper articles, there was a museum donor who was mentioned by name to help make it feel more like a newspaper, but who never came up because she was irrelevant to the rest of the narrative again. And that was very
Mm-hmm.
recently changed to one of the scientist's research assistants who's saying basically the same thing, but they're more direct. They're more the original donor character was described as a friend to the scientist, so it served the same purpose. But this new character was a contributor to the paper, so their name appears there, and they are directly tangentially related to other actions of the story, even if their name isn't mentioned again. So it makes more sense to have it. Same with the critic that opposes the scientist's work in both articles. It could have been
Mm-hmm.
two different critics where it made more sense to be two different people, but because it's the same recurring person, it feels a little bit more it cuts out extraneous extra characters just so that you could make a point that this person was named in a newspaper. So instead, it's
Mm-hmm.
this same recurring. I hesitate to call him an antagonist because he's not important enough to the narrative to be one. He's just kind of
He just
more,
has some
yeah.
opinions.
He's a catalyst to some actions, but he's never like in direct
Mm-hmm.
physical opposition to the scientist's actions.
I was gonna say, I think what you're getting at is also something that I think about a lot when I'm writing short stories, especially when you have a story that's, say, 10 pages, like 5,000 words or less. You really need to be economical with your information. Everything is going to have a through line. And if it doesn't, why is it in your story? Your story has so little space to work with to begin with. And our game is a short game. It's got a succinct narrative, and I think it's important to be economical with not just, word choice, but with plot points as well. Like every plot point is going to be noticed, it's going to be remembered because the experience itself isn't that long. Um, so to throw around things that aren't going to have a lot of impact is just taking space that could instead be used for impact.
Yeah, exactly. And then by doing that, it helps it helps the world building as well, because then you go, does if this character isn't important, is what they add to the overall world of the game important? Because I would argue that unlike the other characters who do come up later and are more tangentially related to the scientist, the critic does forward the world building, because for a scientist to be doing work like we're establishing our scientists to be doing, and to not have vocal critics from other fields who feel that it is not something that they should be doing, would be more unrealistic than someone who's only mentioned once and never pops up again.
Mm-hmm. But to your point, it's not worth it to have two different
Yeah.
critics that have, two different critical opinions, because all we need to establish is that there are critics, and the critics are catalyzing, the revoking of funding and the scientist, um, going a little bit off the deep end instead of always getting praise and always getting the funding and being allowed to run amok, playing with time and physical matter in four
Yeah.
dimensions as much as they want to.
Yeah. That's another
So
element of
it's
our narrative that I like, is that um it's become such a buzzword, and I hate saying it, but that the narrative is very morally gray, in that, like, no one no one in the narrative is necessarily in the wrong or in the right on a meta level. For the case of the narrative, the scientist is in the right because the thing that they were hypothesizing was correct. They did it, but there's no like.
But are they? Because now they're trapped
Now they're
here.
trapped there. But the more like the moral compass of the narrative doesn't lean either way to say unfettered push for scientific advancement at all costs, but it also doesn't say we shouldn't do that. It says, it tempers that and says do it with caution, assess risks, or things could go horribly wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But it does, because like obviously the critic believes they're morally in the right. People were hurt, and it's not ideal. The scientist believes that he is in the right because, well, he's almost on a breakthrough. So what if people got hurt? The character's not perfect. They're a bit megalomaniacal. They're a bit of a narcissist. They're not like without reason to them. You can see why they're like that. The praise that they receive early in the narrative and by being the subject of the museum is not unearned praise. The work is valid, peer-reviewed, like quality scientific work, but their flaw is the core flaw, I think, in the characters, that they ignore criticism and they push forward. They don't allow for people to make a point and then change their opinion based on that. They're very analytical. So if they can prove mathematically that their point is correct, criticism to that point is now invalid. And then that thus pushes them forward to go, okay, now I will build this thing. Now I will wire this thing up. Now it will explode. Now I'm stuck in this looping timeline. I will go forward, forward, forward until I figure out the thing. Not once do they ever not once does the character of the scientist ever like consider that their path might not be the right one.
Which I think makes it a more interesting discovery experience for the players. And it gives them also more things to discuss as two players going through this uncovering events as they read about them. If it was really black and white, I don't think it would foster as much discussion, which, the whole point of the game between the puzzles and the narrative and how we present it is to foster that discussion between the
Yeah.
players.
And that leads to another
So I think it's
another
interesting
big push for the method of back editing, of writing, finishing,
mm-hmm.
and then editing, is that
Mm-hmm.
we established the chancellor that cut the funding to the university project the scientist was working on, and that's mentioned 2 or 3 times. It's mentioned in the article that flatly lays out exactly what happened and the reason it was cut, and then it's laid out in a much more biased way in Notes to the Scientist, where they are bitter and resentful that their funding was cut even though people were injured for it. There is not a note where they express remorse that people were hurt in their pursuit of knowledge. So, and it depends on the order in which you find those notes in the game. So it's taking advantage of that fact that we don't know what order you'll get them, so we can change the perspective you have on the story basically. Because if you find the resentful note first, you're like, oh, this Kovac guy is a dick. He's like, he cut
Mm-hmm.
it. There's no reason he cut it. Or you go, he's a chancellor. He probably had a good reason. I wonder what that reason is. And then you find the newspaper and go, oh, I get it, or oh, that doesn't seem, and depending on how your interpretation of whether or not it was, despite injury, it was acceptable for him to continue on with his funding, it depends on the perspective. Because if you find the newspaper first, you're like, oh, I see, it was cut, and then you find the thing, it's like, oh, this character that's writing his notes is bitter and resentful because his funding got cut because people were hurt and it was his fault.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are multiple ways to view the events of the story based on
the order in which you find the information.
Yeah, the way that you encounter it.
Yeah. And I think from there I want to talk a little bit about kind of broader world building and construction of the world, because as I believe we mentioned on a previous episode, our game was awarded the Sammy Showcase Worldbuilding Honors, the Worldbuilding Award, for excellence in creating a world that felt real and an environment that telling an environmental story in an engaging way. And I think that
so we have received that award. Yeah. We have not received our judges' feedback.
Yes, we're working on getting that. It's been mm-hmm. 2 months now. No,
it's been a minute.
The awards were beginning July. It's been a month. I have mm-hmm. I have no understanding of time anymore.
No, but that is only to preface as we discuss our world building, and we did get this award. All we can tell you is what we think we did well, not
we don't know what
was externally exactly verified.
What was praised specifically about our world building, which is slightly nerve-wracking going forward, because you don't know, are we doubling down on the right things? Were there places where we had a light touch and that was done and that was praised for having that light touch, and then we went in and doubled down and removed the light touch because we thought it would work better there? I don't think we've done that in any extreme level anywhere, but it is definitely interesting to think about, and it's a level of thought where you go, might this be the reason we got it, or are we getting rid of the reason we got it?
Yeah, but we won't know. We won't know quite yet. So for now, our discussion will be centered on our perspective and our thinking behind what we did. So what do you think, Casey? What do you think we did well in our world building?
I think the overall world building, the strengths there were very succinctly telling a story that you could find throughout the world, and also making it so that world, just exploring the world, provided hints to the narrative. You didn't have to read the newspaper articles. You didn't have to find and read the notes. Just the existence of the world and the deterioration, the world going through points as the plot progresses, tells a very simplistic story, but it still tells a story as you go on. There's still
Hmm.
forward momentum in the world despite or in response to the actions of the player.
Hmm.
The world doesn't like ignore the player, because there are a lot of games where it's like your actions have consequences, but the world itself doesn't change on a meta level. It just like maybe little local events change, but it's not broad. I think
Hmm.
the fact that our entire world changes in response to the player's actions depending on the order in which they take them is probably the biggest strength that we have.
Hmm. And not for want of the games that do not do such responsiveness, it's not because they're just ignoring, the player willfully. I think it's a technological limitation. If you think about player actions creating a branching tree, it just becomes too big at some point, um, for games and for engines to really respond to
Especially if you have a
effectively.
broad
Um,
swath of possible player actions. We have a broad swath of
mhm,
actions within puzzles, but the broad swath of
mhm.
like meta player actions in the narrative is very limited, but it allows you to have a
Yes.
very responsive world to each of those limited
Mhm.
actions.
Yeah, it's a essentially it's a linear experience, but within that linear experience, through every level, you have a wide range of things you can do that converge again, which lead you to an action that furthers the world. So it's like, it's a little bit of leading, it's a little bit of responding effectively to the player, but we can respond effectively to the player because we know exactly what they're going to be doing to progress the level. By the time they're putting a piece of the statue back together.
Yeah. And I think that's the other thing, is that it leads to the ideal way, at least in a game where your world is so important, because we've technically, despite all of what we've discussed prior, the main character isn't that important to the actual forward progression story from the beginning of gameplay to the end of gameplay. So the actual actions the player is taking, who they are, isn't important. So we focus more on the world and then reveal who that player is as the story goes on through the environmental storytelling. But
Mhm.
the ability to complete the game is not predicated on the character, is predicated on the world. So
Mhm.
in itself, the world is a living, breathing, responsive character that that acts on the player to move the plot forward.
Well, are there any things that you wanted to talk about now, specifically about writing itself or writing method? Or were there anything else you wanted to say about world building?
I think I don't think anything necessarily specifically about world building, because I could go really in depth into it, because there are a lot of like world building elements that we didn't really that weren't important because the story is not broad enough. Like we didn't have to
Hmm.
develop we our world exists in a world where all we had to really establish was the rules of our quote unquote magic system, of
Hmm.
like, which was just the functionality of this statue. What can it do? What is it possible that it does? What are the in to pull world building terms, what are the limitations on the magic, in which in science fiction is technology? What are the limits on the technological things that the player is capable of doing? And I think that um, we codify that a little bit more in the research paper, but prior to that, it very quickly establishes that this machine manipulates the world around it and allows for certain like weird dimensional phenomena to occur, and it does that without words. And I think that's a relatively decent strength of world building.
Hmm.
I will lean back to you then for other methods and other uh, deep diving world points.
I think you've covered the important stuff. We didn't have to go in and establish, who the scientist was before this project. We didn't have to establish, what happens even after the plot of the story of the game is complete. It's really a contained experience. Like I really try to think about it as a short story. So it has world building, but we were economical in the world that we built, I think.
Yeah, we stayed reasonable in the scope of the world. It was the world. There is a world present outside of the city of Calamdale where the story takes place, and there is a city outside of the university and the museum, which are the only two mentioned locations. But the day-to-day actions of that city aren't important. But there's just enough mention to show that it is present. You're not going to just walk outside the doors and it's going to be a blank void. And writing a story, at least for me, for a while, I would get bogged down in making sure that the whole world made sense until I realized, like, well, the story's only gonna, like, occur here. So the, like, geopolitical everywhere else around here, it's not gonna have an effect on the characters or the overall narrative. It's just that I'm gonna know this world's more fleshed out, but I'm probably never gonna mention this, like, city 60 miles away on a different continent.
Mm-hmm. And that can be a good way to work on a story when your story is much larger. If your story is a novel, that there's a lot of space and time to really make the world feel like detailed and large. But in a short story, in a short game, it's not really necessary. Um, so unless those things had an impact on the story we were telling, we didn't need to bother with them really. And as it turned out, it was the university and the museum, and those were the things that had impacts on the story.
Yeah, and I think that leads back to the diagram that you showed me before we started of the. I've already forgotten the order it goes down the list, but it's.
Ooh, I'll tell you. I will tell you. This is a diagram that I drew up, philosophy that I use to approach writing short stories specifically. And I formulated it when I was reading a short story collection called Unforeseen by Molly Gloss. It's a collection of, I would call them all science fiction short stories. But my diagram of observations from reading her work was that world and place act on characters to create plot. So the top of the diagram is the world. Below that is the place. So more specifically than the world, it's whatever city or town or location you're in. Then below that is characters, and at the bottom is plot. You've got an arrow taking you all the way from world down to plot, which doesn't work for every kind of story that there is, and it's not even a good way to approach every kind of story that there is. But I find it really useful for short stories and also for stuff like our game.
Yeah, and I think even that can even work for like longer frame stories too, because a lot of it is that every single thing that happens in the world happens because of some external force acting on the character. There is hardly ever a case where the entirety of the story is the character's internal conflict with no catalyst, with no like something has to break the character from their normal path forward to enact some kind of arc. And
otherwise there's no story.
There isn't, and our scientist does have an arc. It's not a positive arc. It is a descent into madness that kind of goes into looping forever. But there is an establishment of a character, a thing that happens to that character, and then how they act as a result of that thing that happened to them. And it is all found and like picked up and discovered piecemeal, but the arc is still, you can still put all those little notes together in a rainbow shape and you have an arc. I could probably go on for a good long while about actual specific character arcs and the ways that we can adapt them into games, but I don't think that this is necessarily the time or place to do that. So if you don't have anything else specifically that you want to say, yes, let's dig in on that a little bit more, then I think we can probably end it for this week.
Yeah, I think we've covered everything that I wanted us to cover. I even got to say, my little bit about narrative games being an oxymoron, which
no, I would agree. Some would not agree with you, but I think I would agree with you there.
Narrative games being an oxymoron does not mean that I don't want to create narrative games. I love narrative games and I want to create them, but I fully think that What are you doing?
You have to make concessions on both ends for a narrative game.
But I think I've talked about the things that I wanted to talk about. So, we can always collect little bits of narrative insight and do another deep dive or retrospective when the game is done. But for today, I think I'm good.
All right. Then I think that's what we'll call it. This has been the Indie Voids Development Podcast. I'm Casey.
I'm Amanda.
And thank you very much for listening.